Welcome to 375 High Street, Rochester, and we're sitting in the actual boardroom of Featherstones Limited. He was born in Bicknor in 1874 to a servant family, and his father would have worked in 4 different families. John Thomas, my grandfather, would have learnt the trade through him, and he probably got a job through his father. Somewhere along the line he fell in love with a girl called Hannah, who came from a family of 5 very strong-willed girls. He had started doing this job of going to sea as a servant to the captain of HMS Phoebe, and she said, well, I'm not marrying anyone who disappears to sea for weeks on end, or months on end even. So he went to work at the gun wharf as a clerk for the Admiralty, because he was quite good at figures, and then took on, to earn extra money to set up a home to get married. He took on a job as an insurance rep for the crew, who went round every week and collected a few shillings. And it was going round doing that that opened his eyes into how the working man couldn't easily buy his work clothing or anything else. And he thought, well, while I'm calling to collect the money for the crew, I'll get you a pair of trousers or whatever you want, and you can pay me back over 20 weeks, and I won't charge you any interest. So that's how he came to describe himself as a manufacturer's agent rather than a retailer. And they started in a 2 up, 2 down in number 12 Burren Road, Strood, which is still there. And then they moved to another property at St Mary's Road, Strood, which was bigger for the business, and started to employ other men to go around collecting the money on the sales of clothing. And it sort of took off from there. And then they moved here, where we're sitting, in 1904. And I believe my father was actually born in this property we're sitting in here. And this again was described as a warehouse. It wasn't a retail shop as you would know it today, with display windows and things. And it gradually increased and increased from there. And then obviously needed more space. They took over other buildings. And by and large, most of the things on this side of the High Street belong to St Bart's Hospital, because if you remember, before the National Health Service, which started in 1944, hospitals had to earn money to provide the service they did. And they often owned a big portfolio of property, and it was the rents that came in that kept the hospital alive. Not everything belonged to the hospital, but the majority of property did. And obviously the Georgian House, 351, wasn't a hospital property. It was part of a brewery complex that, as you know, started with, I think someone before Squire Hawkes was the famous entrepreneur in there, and then it went to Charles Arcole, and Charles Arcole sold eventually, and we took that building over from them. One of the things that influenced the business was my grandfather had this idea all the time that he should be educational to the customer. So he furnished the furniture department with antiques for the day-to-day furniture that you used. Like if you came into the entrance lounge, there would be a seat like a church pew, all carved, which he'd bought from a dealer. It became the furniture department, and being a Georgian house, it had separate rooms, so they did room settings. And we were very lucky because we had employed a window display man called Peter Aldridge. Peter was able to do window displays in the front of the Georgian house, in those big windows that were added on the front. And he would do a whole room setting in the right-hand window. And a customer would come in and say, I want that, because they didn't know how to put these things together. But the other thing in there that was my particular interest was the toy department started life in there. And in the 1950s, they had added a staircase to go down from the back of the Georgian house to the warehouses behind, at sort of what would be cellar level. But in the months from the end of November, that was all converted into the toy department. So I always remember I was mad about motor racing, and we did a Scalextrics display in the window, and we wanted these cars to be going all the time that the customers were watching, but they never did. They always got wrong. So I spent a whole period of time up to Christmas trying to get all these things to work. But that was a very exciting part of that building. And then on the top floor was a pram department run by a lovely lady called Mrs. Hunt, who was absolutely superb at looking after customers, and cots and prams and all that sort of apparatus was housed in there. And then eventually, when they built what is now Cycle King, they moved the hardware and electrical department into that, and we had a huge carpet department in the lower floor of the Georgian house. Again, it was very successful because it was the era of fitted carpets. If you remember, before that everyone had rugs and wooden floors. So that was another sort of big interest in that building. They had adopted that system. It was made by a company called Lamson Paragon, and you had a great big pump in the cellar, and then all these tubes going all through the building to be able to communicate with, because every transaction took place on the floor. You didn't put money into a till, you put it into a cylinder which went in this tube, and it shot up to an office upstairs where girls sat around with the tube ends processing the dockets for the sale. So that had to operate throughout the building. And of course, the big complication with Featherstones was it was separated into separate buildings. So each building had a different system. And the one in the menswear, which was the earliest building along the road, which was an overhead wire one where you pulled a lever and a little thing shot along a wire to the cash desk at the end of the store. And everyone you talk to in Medway, whoever shopped here, remembers that. That's their big memory, is this thing. Well, we tried to sell everything we could. Again, in business terms, a very big misjudgment. For example, if you wanted a garden shed, we would have an arrangement with Passmore's. They would sell the customer the shed, and we just took 10%. Sorry, we took a 10% commission. So we must have lost money heavily on all those things. We sold bicycles, we sold even the odd motorbike later on, and all those sort of specialist things were done on a percentage from a specialist dealer, because obviously we hadn't got the experience. We did have a big cycle department, which was quite successful. So the idea was that you could provide anything anybody wanted on credit. So that was a sort of fascinating part of it. Lots of people were lost in World War I, and their relatives wanted to go and visit the graves in northern France and Belgium. So my grandfather started this system of hiring trains and cross-channel ferries to take people to the scenes of World War I. So they chartered these, with the railways, they would charter a whole train which would leave at 5:30 in the morning and go to Dover and go across because the channel ferries were then run by the railways. And that ran in the 1920s, and they could pay for that on credit. So again, people who'd never been able to afford to go abroad could suddenly go and visit Ypres or somewhere that they wanted to see where some relative had been lost. So that was a whole extraordinary thing that didn't come into the normal spectrum retailing. I suppose it's almost a forerunner of travel agent. One of the ones that everyone remembers was I had an idea that we might better find an old aeroplane and use it as a grotto where the child walked into the back of the aeroplane and saw Father Christmas and came out the front. So I went to the airport and said, have you got any abandoned aircraft? And they said, well, there's an aircraft over there that's all overgrown with weeds because the man hasn't paid his fees. So we took a coal lorry up there, took the wings off the aircraft and carried the fuselage down here. We cut a door in the side of the aeroplane fuselage and we installed it in the basement with this make-believe scene of Father Christmas sitting in the pilot's seat and the children coming in. That was just one example. Squire Hawkes was the owner of a brewery, and all the aspects of that thing are still lurking there. For example, if you go down Hawkes Lane on the right-hand side, there's a very dilapidated looking building. And I know when I last went in there, which was several years ago, the stables that housed the horses that towed the beer carts and things were still there to some degree. You know, the drain in the middle and the stalls were still in existence. And little detailed things like, if you look at the roadway going down there, it's cobbled, and the cobblestones get smaller and smaller as you get to the high street. And because there's an incline, you put smaller stones down for the horses' hooves to grip better. All those little details are still lurking. No, there are no tunnels I know of. The basements were, in this particular building we're sitting in, were all interconnected. They're Georgian basements. They weren't, I mean, they were separated with walls obviously to support the building above, but there were no tunnels. When they put the tubes in you referred to earlier, they used a very small dumbwaiter lift shaft going down to the building, so that would have been active. And then I've always been puzzled, when you go in the front of the building and you go towards the left, there's a fantastic historic toilet, which is a beautiful design thing with a mahogany lid and everything. And then there's a sort of funny triangular-shaped room with a fireplace. And I'm told that that's where the landlord collected the rents, because obviously when you owned a brewery like that, you had lots of tenants, and you had pubs that were tied, and they had to come and pay their rent. So that was another sort of interesting aspect.